Hi, I'm Dr. Marilyn. Welcome to Let's Talk Emotionology. On this channel, we explore how emotions shape achievement, leadership, learning, and well-being. Not as abstract theory, but as lived human experience. Our conversations are grounded in my book, Emotionology, From Aristotle to AI. I take the conversations and examine how emotion science has evolved and why, despite all that we know about emotions, so much of everyday life still misunderstands them. Today's episode is entitled, Are You Misreading Emotions? In everyday life, when something goes wrong, especially with performance or achievement, we tend to reach for familiar explanations. We say someone lacks motivation or that they lack discipline. Sometimes we say it's a skills problem. Then, sometimes we simply didn't try hard enough. These explanations feel practical. They feel familiar. They feel reasonable even. However, very often, my friend, they are describing the surface of something much deeper. This conversation is rooted in the prologue of my book, where I describe a pattern that many of us experience, but barely stop to question. Let me read a short passage from the prologue. In this section, I write, in a subsection entitled, We Keep Calling It Motivation Failure. Motivation is often treated as a personal flaw. Sometimes people either lack it or they have it. Yet, the word motivation itself comes from the Latin word movere, meaning to move. At its root, motivation was never about pressure, my friend. And I continue reading. Motivation was about grit or willpower. It was about movement. What initiates it, what sustains it, and what redirects it when conditions change. In another subsection entitled, We Keep Calling It a Skill Deficit, I write, skills do not operate in isolation. They are expressed or withheld within particular conditions, expectations, and internal states. When people stop using skills that they already possess, the explanation is rarely as simple as lack of competence. So what is it? Well, first, let's read a little further. The next section, I talk about what is actually missing. What is missing in these moments that appear like a lack of motivation or a lack of skill is not effort, my friend. It's not ability, structure, or commitment. What is missing is emotion science data. Information about how people are interpreting their experiences, where the value and the controls are lining up within us, or breaking down, and how internal patterns are shaping upward behavior out over time. Also shaping outward behavior over time. Upward behavior would refer to motivation. Outward behavior would refer to skills. What we are often observing is something much quieter and more complex. The structure of the emotions beneath human effort. And that's the passage from my book, the first part of the book, the prologue. So, we expand this in our lived environment, in our experiences? Well, when people struggle at work, in school, or in their personal lives, the first explanation we usually reach for is effort. Oh, you just ain't trying enough. You just don't care. As an educator, either in the classroom or in the office or at the district, I have heard teachers say this over and over. As a corporate trainer, I have heard managers say this over and over. Why are they saying this? Well, it's simple. We assume that if someone simply tried harder, everything would change. From an emotion science point of view, however, effort is only one layer of human behavior, my friend. Underneath effort are our emotions. Remember, mover, to move. That is also the root word for motions. And when we put the E in front of it, then those motions are extending. And that's what we call emotions. Emotions influence how we interpret difficulty, risk, failure, and uncertainty. Think about yourself. Have you ever just shut down and no matter how somebody tried, they couldn't get you going again? Well, let's look at some other examples. A person experiencing persistent anxiety, they are not going to look motivated at all, because that anxiety is coming from what they already perceived as internal failure. Nothing a manager can do, nothing a teacher can do, nothing a parent can do can move that person until they understand the emotion science aspect of it. Why is anxiety happening? Perhaps it's their dominant protective emotion. I write more about that in the book in subsequent sections. Another example, someone experiencing quiet hopelessness may appear undisciplined. I recently wrote a blog about a student who was labeled EBD, emotionally behaviorally disturbed, and placed in special education. When I ran his emotion science data profile, his dominant protective emotion was actually hopelessness, not anger. Another example, someone carrying shame about past performance may appear disengaged. They're like, well, last time I didn't do well, so I don't know if I want to try. Again, if shame is your dominant protective emotion, you are going to use that as a facade to protect yourself. I don't want people to think I look stupid. I don't want people to say X, Y, Z. And unless that individual has their emotion science data profile and or their team leader has it, no one will know how to use the correct skills to move past the stuck nature of these examples. So, from the outside, all of these situations look like the same problem. However, my friend, from an emotion science perspective, these are completely different experiences. As such, each one requires a different kind of understanding. That is why when I measure emotions and analyze them and produce the emotion science data profile, I actually highlight each dominant fuel and protective emotion and show the skill sets needed to work through them. We can't change a person and their emotional profile, but we can give them strategies to work through them so that they're not stuck, so they don't appear like they are unmotivated. So, how do we get there? What is the pattern that we have to recognize? Well, first of all, we need to answer the question, why do we keep defaulting to these simple explanations? Number one thing, partly because they're familiar. And y'all know that saying, familiarity breeds what? Contempt. So, we need to remove the familiarity aspect. Secondly, partly because the language of emotion science has not fully entered everyday life. That's why a lot of people keep scrolling through my content. It seems unfamiliar, and so they back away. They'd rather hold on to the familiar, no matter how stuck the familiar has us. So, researchers prior to me in my work have spent decades studying how emotions shape learning, performance, leadership, and well-being. I told you in episode 1 that I got stuck on this idea 50 years ago. As a freshman at the new College of the Bahamas, I was in the first graduating class. And I did a class called Motivation, Emotion, and Learning. This class was had its foundation in these early researchers. So this work has been ongoing for a while, my friend. Dr. Marilyn didn't just come up with something, like a lot of people like to say. But I digress. Because in everyday conversation, we still rely on simplified explanations like motivation, like discipline, like talent or skill. That gap, that's the problem. That gap between emotion, science, and what it can tell us, and how we talk about human experiences, is where confusion often begins. What do I mean? Because we're not grasping the research of emotion science, we are holding on to our experiences, the familiarity. And that's where the confusion about what to do to get unstuck comes into play. So, in every episode, I have this integration moment, a moment where we're putting it all together, from your lived experiences to what I read and what I wrote and just read from the book, and what needs to happen to move us forward. So, our integration moment for episode 2, it starts with why emotionology life exists. Why did I come up with all of this? Well, emotionology life exists to help bridge this gap. And I discussed that further in the prologue of the book, but we won't read another excerpt. How do we bridge this gap? Not by replacing existing knowledge, because the existing knowledge is important, but by organizing this existing knowledge in a way that connects emotion science with real life experience. A lot of people think researchers like myself want to change things. No, research is an ever building platform. You have the foundation, then another layer, then another layer. For instance, you'll read in my book, The Foundation of My Work. It started with Freud and his motivational theory. Then it went to Bernard Weiner and his attributional theory. So for Freud is saying, what drives you? Bernard Weiner is saying, okay, so I have a drive. Why should I do it? What's in it for me? Then the next layer for me was Reinhard Peckrun. He came up with the control value theory of achievement emotions. In other words, he says control what you value and value what you control, and that will determine how you decide to use that motivation. Then came my theory, camp achievement theory, which says that we will only move forward when we understand our fuel and protective emotions, my friend. So we don't want to replace existing knowledge. We want to organize it in a way that connects emotion science with what you're really experiencing in your everyday life. Why do we want to do this? Well, simple. When we understand the structure of the emotions behind our efforts, then we can begin to see human behavior differently. We'll become less judgmental. We'll stop labeling and categorizing based on what we see externally. Then we will be able to see things with clarity and compassion. This, my friend, is how Emotionology Life helps us to see patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. This is where the emotion science data profiles that I generate will help us to understand the patterns. So, why do we need to understand these patterns? Well, first of all, not to replace what we already know about human behavior. That's where, my friends, the psychologists, the therapists, the psychiatrists come in. I am not clinical. I am not therapeutic. I am research-based. And I say that on my website, and I say that in my book. So, I don't want to replace what we already know about human behavior. After all, that's the foundation of my work. What I want us to do is use emotion science data to organize it in a way that connects emotion science, like I said earlier, with what? Everyday life and our lived experiences. That's the integration moment. So what? Well, simply put, when we stop assuming that every struggle is a motivation problem, then we begin asking better questions. We can ask questions about interpretation because we have data. Think about the most important data to you. That's the bottom line in your checkbook. You ask questions. Where did my money go? What did I spend it on? Same thing with the emotion science data. We need to ask questions about interpretation. What does this fuel protected emotion mean? And what does it mean in relationship to the next person? For instance, I do couple profiles where I show the connection between the fuel emotions called correlations. Do they go up positively together, you and your mate? Does one go up positively and one come down negatively? So, if we are able to interpret the data, we'll then be able to have clarity and compassion about the behavior. Another question about meaning. Where is this behavior coming from? Sure, it might be my mama, my daddy, my teacher when I was in second grade, but there is an underlying premise. Maybe it's based on your fright or flight, your survival instincts in the back of the brain, the cerebellum is saying, hey, run away from this. You don't want to deal with it. So that's why instead of being committed to a relationship, you simply walk away. So we need to have questions about meaning. What other questions do we need, my friend? We need questions about how people experience effort, challenges, and possibilities. That's why some people appear to give up or appear demotivated or appear to lack skills. We have to have the data in order to ask the right questions to help to move these people forward. Then, when these questions change, our understanding of achievement begins to change as well. So, with this integration, we are able to then stop calling it a motivation problem. Stop calling it a skills problem. Stop calling it what it is not. And my friend, we will be able to stop misreading emotions, ours and others. So what, Dr. Marilyn? We spent the last few minutes talking about this. So what? What's my next step? Well, here it is, my friend. First of all, you want to like, share, subscribe. That's for me. Then you want to stay tuned for episode 3. That's a good one. Did you ever want to kill your teenager? Episode 3 is going to help you stay out of jail. But before we get to episode 3, if this perspective resonates with you and you're curious about how emotion science can help you understand your own patterns of achievement, well-being, and growth, it's simple. You can learn more through our platform at Emotionology Life. You can go to my website, emotionologylife.com. You can go to Instagram, you can go to Facebook, or you can go to LinkedIn. And of course, here on YouTube. Whether through an Emotionology Life program profile, whether you hire me to get a profile, or whether you commission me for a speaking engagement, training, or consulting. All of these are ways to help bridge the gap between emotions and everyday life, my friend. So please, connect with me today. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, my friends, be good to yourself first. Then you can be great for everyone else.